In this video, we will talk about how we can evaluate the quality or the research quality of a qualitative research project. And we'll focus on 3 criteria or concepts that are commonly used to evaluate research quality in qualitative research, namely reliability, validity, and whether the research can be used to generalize. First of all, reliability. Reliability is about the quality of your data and the data collection process, or the research project more in general. In quantitative research, there's an aim or idea that it should be possible to replicate or repeat a study and arrive at exactly the same conclusions. This is not possible in qualitative research because one of the defining characteristics of qualitative research is that the researcher is also a kind of research instrument. The researcher will always have an influence on the research process, the data collection, the analysis, and because of that, the conclusions. So the question is not whether a study can be repeated in exactly the same way and arrive at exactly the same conclusions, but the question is, how has the data been influenced by the way in which it was collected and analyzed? For instance, if you've been doing interviews, how has the researcher influenced the dynamics of the interviews in terms of positionality, the gender, age, personality, religious background, political views of the viewer? How has that influenced how the interview went? The place the interview was conducting, how questions were phrased. In observation, how did your presence as a researcher influence the data that you got? And this is also related to what we've been talking about in a previous video about positionality. How can you then strengthen the reliability of your research project and thereby strengthening the research quality of your project? Well, it's important to be open about what you've been doing. And this is related to 2 terms called transparency and reflexivity. First of all, to be transparent means that you account for the research project and all the choices you made and everything that happened that's relevant for a reader to know in order to be able to understand how you went about collecting and analyzing your data, so that the reader can understand the different steps of the research process. Give as much detail as you can, so that it's possible for others to understand how you arrived at your specific interpretations and conclusions. And then to reflect upon the choices that you made, reflect upon how your own positionality has influenced the research, reflect upon how various things that happened, challenges that arose, how that had an impact on the research that you conducted. So it's about another concept that's sometimes used is to leave an audit trail, to leave some traces of the process and the choices made, to be transparent. And in a master thesis, this is done primarily in the method chapter. This is where you account for the research project and justify the methodological choices and reflect upon issues that might have affected your research. The second criteria or concept used when talking about research quality is validity. And validity is about the quality of your interpretations and conclusions. To what extent are your conclusions and interpretations based on your data? Is there a fit between your data and your conclusions? To what extent are your conclusions an answer to your research question? Do you actually answer the research question based on your data? Or do you maybe answer a different research question and then the research question should be adjusted? So when we evaluate the interpretations and conclusions, we need to know what the research question is to be able to see if there's a fit and to see if the data you've collected are relevant for your research question. For instance, if you've been interviewing poor people, you might be able to say something about how people experience living in poverty, but you might not be able to answer the question of why these people are poor, because that would require that you gather other kinds of data. There are several techniques that you can use to strengthen the validity of your study. And some of these techniques might be relevant for you to use. Some of them might be too time consuming or not possible to use. So do not see this list as a list that you have to do all of them, but there can give you some ideas of how to work with validity in a research project. First of all, you can, for instance, if you're doing interviews, ask for feedback on your interpretations during data collection. You can share a preliminary interpretation and invite the informant to confirm, challenge, or nuance your understanding. You can ask questions such as, do I understand you correctly that, or do you mean that? This is, of course, not always possible, because it might be that some of your interpretations, you don't have them, you haven't arrived at these understandings during the interview itself, but at least to make sure as far as possible that you have understood the interviewee correctly. And this requires some practice. Sometimes it's then useful after an interview to go through the interview again and to look for places where you should have asked follow-up questions to clarify, to make sure that you'd understood the interviewee correctly. It's also possible to combine different research methods, combining qualitative and quantitative methods, what's often called mixed methods, or to combine data from different qualitative methods, to combine observation with interviews or interviews with textual analysis. This is not always practically feasible, or you might not have the time to do it, but it could be a good strategy in order to strengthen the validity of your research project. And then thirdly, to account for the basis of your interpretations. That means to account for what kind of concepts and theories have you used to analyze your data. Which understandings of these concepts have you relied on in your analysis? How has your positionality as an insider, as an outsider, as a combination of these two influenced what you see, what you observe, the kind of questions you ask, how you were perceived by the research participants, what kind of role you were ascribed to during observation? All these things are relevant to account for. The concepts and theories that you have used, you will present and discuss in the theory chapter, whereas issues related to positionality would be included in the method chapter. Fourthly, be critical to your own interpretations. Look for examples that confirm and challenge your interpretations. Look for alternative explanations and interpretations. Present your interpretations to others, supervisors and others. Get feedback. Do a second round of analysis to make sure that your interpretations are firmly grounded in your data. And lastly, compare your interpretations with previous research. If you found studies that are similar or very closely related to your own research, maybe they haven't interviewed exactly the same people or observed in exactly the same settings, but there's some relevance. Compare your interpretations with the interpretations in these studies. Similar conclusions and interpretations might help to strengthen your own conclusions. And if other researchers have arrived at other conclusions, it doesn't mean necessarily that your research is wrong, but you should ask yourself, okay, why did we arrive at different conclusions? Maybe it's because of differences in the research process, that the data is quite different, the methods employed are different, the contexts are quite different, there's a different time period or geographical context. Or maybe you've been using different concepts and theories to analyze quite similar empirical data, and that's the reason why you have arrived at different conclusions. Lastly, we will say something about generalization, of what is sometimes called external validity, because it is about to what extent your interpretations and conclusions are valid or relevant beyond your specific units of analysis, the people you've been interviewing, the setting where you've been observing, or the specific text that you have analyzed? Can your interpretations and conclusions from your particular study be generalized or transferred to other contexts, other places, other situations, other people, other kinds of text? And there are different concepts that are used when talking about generalization. One common distinction is between statistical generalization or analytical or theoretical generalization. Statistical generalization is often an aim in quantitative research. It means to generalize from a sample to a population if you have a sample that's randomly selected and representative of the larger population. You are then, in a way, generalizing from your specific units of analysis on an empirical level to other units that were not part of the study. Let's say that you've done a survey questionnaire with a sample of master students in Norway, and then you want to generalize from this sample to all master students in Norway. Statistical generalization, as I've mentioned in a previous video, is a common aim in quantitative research, but it's problematic in qualitative research because qualitative research often relies on small sample sizes, and the sample is not random and it's not representative. So you cannot automatically say that what the conclusions you arrived on based on your sample is valid for the larger population, that your units of analysis, the people you've interviewed, your text, or the setting you've observed is relevant for other similar units of analysis. But it's often possible in qualitative research to do what is called analytical or theoretical generalization. And that means that the interpretations that you arrive at, or maybe you even develop some new concepts or theories, that these interpretations can be relevant in other empirical studies, in other contexts, using other samples. That these interpretations that you have arrived at might provide a guide for what to expect in other studies. And whether your interpretations are valid or not in a new context depends on how similar or different the two contexts are. Let's say that you have studied how students in a high school in Oslo express or hide their religious beliefs. And you have interviewed 10 high school students in your study. In a qualitative research project, your conclusions are primarily valid only for the 10 students you have interviewed. So you can only say something about how these 10 students express or hide their religious beliefs. But some of your interpretations and conclusions might be valid for other contexts. Could be valid for other students at the same school, because the students you have interviewed are not necessarily representative of other students at the same school. Your interpretations could be valid for other high schools in Oslo, other high schools in Norway, or other high schools in general, depending on the similarity and differences between your context in your study and other contexts. So you cannot say for sure that your interpretations are valid beyond your context. That in order to do that, you would have to conduct more research in those other contexts. But you can say that there might be some reason for transferring some of these interpretations to other contexts. So it's a lot about how you phrase, what kind of phrasing you use, what kind of words you use. Not saying that this is valid, but that it might be valid. And making sure that when you talk about your interpretations, that you talk about that these apply primarily to your units of analysis, the people you've interviewed, the text you've analyzed, the setting you've observed, but that there might be some relevance beyond your specific context.